The clock was the first thing she noticed, not the snow building up against the windshield, not the darkness pressing in from both sides of the road where the trees had begun to crowd together so tightly they swallowed the headlights whole. Not the silence from the man behind the wheel, which had stopped feeling like silence 20 minutes ago and started feeling like a wall. The clock. Lavinia Caldwell had not meant to take it off her wrist. She never meant to. It was a habit so old it had stopped being a habit and become something closer to breathing, something the body did when the mind was occupied elsewhere. Robert's watch, a Timex he had bought in 1987 with the first bonus check he ever received for teaching a modest amount from a modest school district that he had treated like a fortune because he was that kind of man. Not expensive, not impressive, but it kept perfect time for 31 years, and when Robert died, Lavinia had kept wearing it because the alternative was a wrist that felt like a missing word in a sentence she already knew by heart. Her right hand was wrapped around it now, the metal warm from her skin, the small tick of it just barely audible beneath the sound of the heater running and the wind picking up outside. Her left hand rested on the back seat beside her palm, flat against the plastic shell of the infant car seat carrier, feeling the faint warmth that radiated through it from the small body nestled inside. Iris was asleep. That at least was one mercy. Lavinia looked out the passenger window at the dark wall of trees and tried to remember the last road sign she had seen. She could not. They had left the lighted streets of Harwick nearly 40 minutes ago, merged onto a state highway she recognized, and then Dalton had taken an exit that led not toward any town she knew, but onto a two-lane road that narrowed with every mile. The pavement had given way to gravel. The gravel had given way to something that was barely a road at all, just two compressed lines in the earth where tires had passed before, maybe years before, maybe longer. She had asked twice where they were going. He had not answered either time. Dalton Holloway drove the way he did everything else, with the kind of controlled efficiency that used to strike Lavinia as competence, and now in the dark on a road that was becoming less of a road, with every quarter mile struck her as something colder than that. His hands were at the correct position on the steering wheel. His jaw was set. His eyes were fixed forward. He was not fidgeting, not nervous, not uncertain. He was executing. Lavinia turned her head and looked at him fully, the way she had been avoiding doing for the past 20 minutes. And what she saw in his face in the pale glow of the dashboard lights made something in her chest go very quiet and very still. She had seen that look before. Not on him. On the faces of men she had observed over 60 years of being a careful watcher of the world. It was the look of a man who had already made a decision and was now simply carrying it out. The hard part was done. This was only logistics. The car slowed, stopped. Outside, the storm that the Weather Service had been predicting for 3 days had finally arrived in full. Snow moved sideways across the headlight beams, thick and purposeful, and the trees on both sides of the road were enormous and black and close. Their branches fused together overhead into something that was not quite a ceiling and not quite open sky. There was nothing here. No structure, no light, no sign of any human presence for what felt like miles in every direction. Dalton turned off the engine. The silence that followed was so complete that Lavinia could hear Iris breathing. He got out of the car without a word. His door shut with a sound that was final in a way she could not fully explain, the click of the latch like a period at the end of a sentence she had not been given permission to read. A moment later, her own door was pulled open and the storm came in. Not gradually, but all at once, a wall of cold and wind that hit her like a physical thing, tearing through her funeral dress and the thin wool coat she had worn to bury her daughter 7 days ago and had not yet found the will to replace with something warmer. Dalton stood in the open doorway. The cold did not seem to touch him. "Get out," he said. Lavinia looked up at him from the passenger seat. She was 73 years old, and she had faced things in her life that would have ended lesser people, and she was not a woman who frightened easily. But what she felt looking at his face in that moment was not quite fear and not quite shock. It was the particular vertigo of a person who has just realized that the ground they were standing on was never solid to begin with. "What are you doing?" she said. Not a question. Her voice was too steady for a question. This is the consequence, Dalton said. She made her choice. She listened to you instead of the doctors instead of me. You were there every step. You encouraged her. So this is where that ends. He reached past her into the back seat with the calm, unhurried movements of a man performing a task he had thought through carefully in advance. He unclipped Iris's carrier from the base, lifted it, and held it out to Lavinia. The gesture was not rough. It was something worse than rough. It was indifferent, the way a person hands off a package they have no further use for, the way a man sets something down at a lost and found counter and walks away without looking back. She's my problem, he said, and now she's yours. Lavinia took the carrier. Her hands were not shaking. She did not know how that was possible, but they were not. Dalton got back in his car. The lock engaged with a sound so small it should not have been audible over the wind, but Lavinia heard it with perfect clarity. The engine turned over. The headlights swept a slow arc through the falling snow as he turned the car around on the narrow track, and then the red glow of the taillights began to move away from her, growing smaller, becoming a smear of color in the white dark, and then becoming nothing at all. The storm closed in behind him like water closing over a stone. Lavinia stood in the dark with Robert's watch in her right hand and her granddaughter in her left, and the cold was not metaphorical. It was immediate and absolute, the kind of cold that does not negotiate, that finds every gap in your clothing and occupies it. The funeral dress offered nothing. The wool coat was doing its best and failing. Her feet in the low-heel black shoes she had bought for another funeral 3 years ago had already begun to lose sensation at the toes. She did not move. For 4 minutes, she did not move. Later, she would not be able to say with certainty what she thought about during those 4 minutes. She would remember pieces of it. She would remember thinking about Robert, about the particular stillness that had settled over his face in the hospital bed in those last hours, a stillness that was not peace exactly, but was not pain either, something beyond both of those things. She would remember thinking that Robert was not a complicated man. He was a man who looked at problems the way he looked at a broken thing in the house, without drama, without self-pity, with only the practical interest of someone who intended to fix it. He would not have stood still in this storm, not because he was brave, because he did not have the habit of standing still when there was something to be done. Lavinia Caldwell pressed Robert's watch between her palms, and then she turned away from the road, away from the direction the taillights had gone, and she stepped off the packed surface of the logging track and into the trees. The forest took her immediately. The darkness in there was of a different quality than the darkness on the road, deeper and more textured, broken only by the ghost light that the snow itself threw upward from the ground, a pale, diffuse glow that illuminated nothing clearly but made everything visible as shadow. The trees were old-growth hemlocks and sugar maples and white pines whose trunks were wider than Lavinia's arm span, their lower branches pruned by decades of competing for light, so that the first limbs began 12 or 15 feet overhead. The ground was uneven beneath the snow roots and rocks, and the bomb-collapsed places where old stumps had rotted into the earth, and Lavinia found each of them with her inadequate shoes, each stumble, jarring Iris in the carrier, each near fall requiring a recovery that cost more than she had to spend. She did not go back toward the road. She remembered something her father had told her when she was perhaps 9 years old, walking with him through the woods outside the small Vermont town where she had grown up. He had been a laconic man, her father not given to instruction, but he had stopped that day and looked around at the forest with an expression of practical assessment and said, "Wind blows harder in the open, Lavinia. Follow where it gets quieter. That's where the shelter is. That's where things stand long enough to be worth something." She was not following that memory consciously. She was simply moving, placing one foot and then the other, holding Iris's carrier against her body to share what little warmth she had, and the direction she moved was into the wind's shadow rather than against its face. The snow came down without pause or mercy. Iris had been quiet since the car. The silence of a newborn, too cold and too displaced to process what was happening into any kind of response. Lavinia felt that silence like a hand around her heart, and it was that more than anything, more than the cold or the dark or the impossibility of her situation, that kept her legs moving when they wanted to stop. "Not yet. Not you." I will not let that happen to you." She did not say it aloud. She said it the way you say the things that matter most without sound, in the part of you that is older than language. She stumbled and fell to one knee, and the snow came up to meet her palm, and her hands screamed with cold. She pushed herself upright. She kept going. And then in the scattered ghost light of the snow, she saw them. Two lines in the ground, pressed into the earth beneath the powder parallel, and faint and almost invisible curving between the trees in a gentle arc that suggested intention rather than accident. Not a path, something older than a path. The compressed memory of a road that had not been traveled in years, maybe decades. Two ruts left by wheels that had passed through this forest long before Lavinia was born, preserved in the underlying soil like a whisper that had outlasted the voice that made it. She stopped. She looked at those two lines for a long moment while the storm moved around her. Then she placed her feet carefully between them and began to follow. The ground was firmer here. That was real. Whatever had compressed the earth in those two channels had made it more resistant to the soft collapse of deep snow, and Lavinia found her footing more reliably, stumbling, less able to keep a pace that was still agonizingly slow, but was at least forward. The trail curved upward through the trees, climbing the mountain's flank in long switchbacks, and the wind had become quieter as the trees thickened around her, the ancient hemlocks gathering close enough to buffer the worst of the storm's force. She did not know how long she walked. Time had lost its usual structure. There was only the rhythm of her breath and the weight of the carrier and the two faint lines in the snow ahead of her feet. And she followed them the way you follow the only light in a dark room, not because you know where it leads, but because the alternative is standing still in the dark. When she saw the shape, she almost did not trust it. A dark rectangle against the swirling white solid and angular, in a landscape that had no straight lines. She blinked. She looked away and looked back. It was still there. A structure. A small one pressed against a rock face that rose behind it like a hand cupping a candle from the wind, built of logs so weathered they had gone nearly black, and a fieldstone foundation that looked as though it had grown directly from the mountain. It was the most beautiful thing Lavinia Caldwell had ever seen. She crossed the clearing at something faster than a walk and slower than a run, her legs giving out on the porch steps so that she sat down hard on the rough-hewn wood, the carrier in her lap. The storm at her back, the solid weight of the structure in front of her, offering something she had not felt since Dalton's taillights disappeared. The sense that something was going to hold. The door was swollen from years of moisture. She hit it with her shoulder 3 times, each impact costing her something she was not sure she could afford. And on the third try, it gave scraping inward with a groan of old wood, and Lavinia pulled the carrier through the gap and into the darkness beyond. Inside, cold but still. No wind, the scent of cold stone and dry cedar and decades of emptiness. In the gray light filtering through a single grimy window, she could make out the shapes of furniture under dusty canvas, a table, a rocking chair, and dominating the far wall. A fieldstone fireplace large enough to stand in its grate, empty and black. But beside the hearth, in a wooden box that someone had left there and never returned to empty, were logs, dry ones, and a handful of smaller sticks for kindling. And on the mantel, a tin box, inside matches. Lavinia set Iris's carrier on the table and went to the fireplace. The first match broke against the striker. The second failed to catch. Her hands were shaking now, the cold having finally worked its way through the determination she had been using as insulation, and she made herself stop. She looked at Iris's face in the carrier, at the blue tinge at the edges of those small lips, at the too pale skin, and she thought with a clarity that cut through everything else, not yet, not while I can still prevent it, and she cupped her hands together over the third match and struck it with the full weight of that thought behind the gesture. A flame, small, yellow, brave in the way that only small flames in large darknesses are brave. Lavinia touched it to a wisp of dry moss she had found among the kindling. The moss caught. She fed it twigs and sticks, then finally a small log. Her hands still shaking, but steady enough, and the fire crackled and spoke, and the shadows in the cabin began to move, and the cold began very slowly to remember that it was not the only thing in the room. She pulled the rocking chair from under its canvas shroud and placed it before the hearth and sat down with Iris in her arms, the baby's small body held against her chest, where the heat was returning fastest, and she began to rock. Outside, the storm still threw itself against the logs with everything it had. Inside, the fire said otherwise. Lavinia looked into the flames and let herself think for the first time since the car door had opened and the cold had come in about what had actually happened. About Dalton Holloway standing in the road with that look of logistical completion on his face. About the way he had handed Iris to her like cargo. About the click of the car lock and the slow disappearance of the taillights. She had seen it coming. That was the truth she had been carrying 4 days since before the funeral, since before Candace's death, and she had chosen not to look at it directly because looking at it directly would have meant acknowledging that her daughter had spent the last years of her life bound to a man whose regard for human beings was at its core the regard of a person who saw people as instruments. She had said something to Candace once 3 months after the wedding. They had been sitting on Candace's porch on a summer evening, and Lavinia had looked at her daughter and said in the careful way she said important things, the kind of man who sees you as a person rather than something he has acquired is worth more than all the rest of them put together. Candace had laughed softly and said, "You worry too much, Mom." And Lavinia, because she loved her daughter more than she loved being right, had let it go. She had not forgotten it. She rocked Iris and watched the fire and held Robert's watch in her free hand, and the ticking of it was steady in the dark cabin, and she thought he would have built this fire faster than I did. And the thought made her smile in a way that had no happiness in it, but had something that was not grief either, something harder and more durable than grief. There was a decision in front of her that she did not need to articulate to understand. She was 73 years old. She was in an unknown location in a New Hampshire forest in the middle of a blizzard. She had $87 in her purse, a half roll of peppermints, the photograph she always carried of Robert, and a young Candace standing outside the Harwick Public Library in a Timex watch that kept perfect time. She had a newborn granddaughter with blue-tinged lips who was by the warmth now returning to her small hands going to survive this night. She could not control what came next. She could not know how long the firewood would last, or whether anyone would find them before it ran out, or what Dalton had already told the police about where she was. She could not know any of that. What she could do was be here in this room with this fire, with this child. That was the decision. It was not a small one. Lavinia Caldwell, who had given up an art school scholarship to care for her dying mother, without a word of complaint, who had worked 2 jobs for 11 years to put her daughter through university, who had handed over her entire life savings as a down payment on a house for a marriage. She had reservations about because her daughter wanted it, who had stood at her daughter's graveside in a wool coat that was too thin for the weather, because she had spent the coat money on the baby's car seat, settled back into the rocking chair with her granddaughter against her chest, and watched the fire burn down to coals, and then built it back up again, and watched it burn and built it up again, until the first gray light of a new day began to filter through the grimy window of a cabin she did not yet know was hers. She did not sleep. She kept watch. And when the storm finally broke in the hours before dawn, and the world outside the cabin window went from chaos to the profound, unbroken silence of deep, fresh snow, Lavinia looked around the room she was in, at the rough-hewn walls and the dusty furniture and the massive fieldstone fireplace, and she thought, this is not where I came to die. She put Robert's watch back on her wrist, and she began to take stock of what she had to work with. Day 9. That was how Lavinia had begun to measure time, not by the clock on her wrist, but by the number of mornings she had woken to find Iris still breathing and the fire still catchable from the night's coals. 9 mornings. 9 times she had opened her eyes in the dark of the cabin and lay still for 1 full second before allowing herself to check. The second of not knowing had become a ritual she performed with the discipline of a woman who understood that hope handled carelessly was more dangerous than despair. Iris was breathing. The coals were catchable. That was day 9. She did not think about Dalton on day 9. She had stopped thinking about Dalton somewhere around day 4, not because the anger had passed, but because anger required a portion of fuel she could not afford to burn on something that produced no heat. What she thought about on day 9 as she rebuilt the fire with hands that had stopped bleeding from the cold around day 6 and had started instead to crack along the knuckle lines in a way that was less dramatic and more permanent was Candace. That was harder. That was the thing she had no language for and no strategy against. Dalton was a problem with a shape. Candace was a loss with no edges. Something that started everywhere and ended nowhere, and the moments it hit hardest were not the moments Lavinia expected. Not at dawn, not when she held Iris. It hit when she was doing something ordinary and small, splitting kindling with a short-handled hatchet she had found hanging on a nail behind the door, or pressing snow into the tin pot to melt for water, and the mundanity of the task would suddenly make the absence enormous because Candace should have been somewhere doing something ordinary and small, and she was not, and she never would be again. Lavinia had not cried since the night she found the fireplace. She was not ready to. She was not sure she could afford to yet. On the morning of day 3, she had nearly failed. The fire had gone out in the night the first time that had happened, because Lavinia had finally fallen into something deeper than the vigilant doze she had been allowing herself and had slept for 3 continuous hours. She woke to a cabin that was cold in a way that was different from before a working cold, a cold with intention, and Iris was making a sound she had not made before, a thin, reedy note at the very edge of audible, the sound of a small body working very hard just to maintain itself. Lavinia had gone to the fireplace with hands that would not cooperate. The first match broke. The second produced a spark that died before it became a flame. She was on her knees on the stone hearth with a tin box of matches in her lap, and she looked at Iris in the carrier on the table, and she thought with a clarity that had nothing comforting about it, "I do not know if I can do this." She had not said it aloud. She had said it in the interior place where the true assessments happen, the place that does not traffic in reassurance. "I do not know if I can do this." Then she had taken the third match and cupped her palms around it, the way she had learned, and struck it, and the flame came, and she built the fire back up, and Iris's sound changed from that thin working note to the more ordinary complaint of a cold and hungry infant, and Lavinia had sat back on her heels and breathed. Not triumph, not relief. Something more stripped down than either, just the next moment arriving and her still in it. By day 7, she had established what passed for a routine which was less a schedule than a set of non-negotiable priorities arranged in order of urgency. Fire first, always. Then Iris, the feeding that required heating water from melted snow to the right temperature. The careful measuring of the formula powder she had found in the diaper bag Dalton had, in some final practical irony, left clipped to the carrier. Then the cabin itself, the systematic work of sealing the gaps between logs with whatever she could find, moss from the porch steps, strips of fabric from the hem of her funeral dress. A decision she made without sentiment, because the dress was not keeping anyone warm, hanging on a body, and it might keep someone warm pressed into a wall. The cabin was revealing itself slowly, the way old things do when someone pays them attention. A hook behind the door holding a short-handled hatchet, iron-headed and still serviceable. A shelf near the back wall with 3 rusting tin cans of dried beans and one of coffee that had long ago lost any scent. A wooden chest in the corner locked that she could not open, but that had made a useful surface. A coil of rope in the rafters. A cast-iron skillet hanging on the wall that she brought down and cleaned with snow until it was usable. Each discovery was a small event. Not exciting, just meaningful the way a word you needed is meaningful when you find it. On the morning of day 14, Iris smiled. It was the reflexive, unfocused smile of a newborn who is not yet smiling at anything in particular. A brief rearrangement of features produced by some interior process that has nothing to do with happiness or recognition. Lavinia knew this. She was a woman who had raised a child and read enough books to understand the developmental timeline of infants. She knew what that smile was and was not. She chose to take it as a message anyway. It was the first time since the night in the forest that she felt something she could not call survival and could not call grief, and that sat strange and tentative in the region of her chest where hope lived, when hope was being careful about showing itself. She did not examine it too closely. She let it be there. It was Crispin Northgate who changed the calculus. Lavinia did not know his name for several weeks. She did not know anything about him except that he was tall and weathered and wore the dark green of the State Forestry Service, and that he had been watching the cabin for at least 3 days before he approached, which she deduced from the different distances at which she had caught the sense of being observed. Never a shape she could fix, just a quality of the silence that was different from the silence of an unwatched place. She was on the porch on the morning of the 22nd day, filling the tin pot with clean snow. From the porch railing, when he stepped out of the trees at the edge of the clearing and stopped at a distance that was deliberate. He did not call out. He stood and looked at the smoke coming from the chimney, and then he looked at her, and he did not move any closer than he already was. Lavinia set the pot down on the porch rail. The space between them was maybe 40 feet of open snow, and across it she could see enough of his face to read the intention in it, which was not threat and not authority, and not the particular kind of sympathy that people brought when they had already decided what your situation was. He was reading her the same way she was reading him. Two people assessing. "I'm not going to come any closer than this unless you tell me it's all right," he said. His voice carried without effort in the cold air a low, steady sound. Lavinia said nothing. "There's a stand of dry dead oak on the other side of the east ridge," he said. "Slit bark already seasoned. Burns 4 hours to a log. I can show you the way, or I can draw it if you have something to write on." He was not looking at her face while he said this. He was looking at the tin pot on the porch railing and the smoke from the chimney and the cabin in general. The way a person looks at a problem they are trying to understand before they offer any solution. Then Iris made a sound from inside the cabin. Small, ordinary, the sound of a baby shifting in a makeshift crate cradle. The man went very still, not alarmed. Something else. Something that moved across his face and then was controlled and set aside so efficiently that Lavinia might have missed it if she had not spent 3 decades watching the faces of people who came into a library and did not always want to say what they were looking for. She made her decision not because she trusted him. She had trusted Dalton Holloway for years and had a reasonable understanding of where that led. She made it because Iris would need formula within 6 hours, and she was on the last of the powder, and because the oak he was describing would last longer and burn hotter than the mixed wood she had been burning, and because the man across the snow had mentioned the ridge and the seasoning as his opening statement, which was not what a man said if what he wanted was information or power. "I have a piece of charcoal," she said, "from the fire." He nodded. He did not move toward the porch. "I'll draw it then." He crouched in the snow at that same 40-foot distance and drew the route on a piece of bark he pulled from his jacket pocket, and when he was done, he set it on top of the snowpack and stepped back, and Lavinia walked out to get it without either of them saying anything further. On the bark, a clear, simple map. The ridge, the stand of trees, a small mark indicating the specific slope where the dead oak grew thickest. Accurate, she would discover when she followed it 2 days later. Precise. He was gone before she reached the porch again. The next morning there was a crate at the base of the large pine at the clearing's edge. Inside, a bag of flour, a block of salt, a proper hatchet with a handle that fit a hand better than the short iron one from behind the door, and 2 cans of infant formula. No note, no name, no expectation of anything in return. Lavinia stood at the clearing's edge with the crate in her arms and looked at the place where the trees began, and felt something that was not gratitude exactly, because gratitude required a recipient, and she did not yet know who she was feeling it toward. It was more like the sensation of discovering that the world, which had recently demonstrated its capacity for a specific kind of cruelty, also retained in some of its people a specific kind of decency that asked for nothing back. She did not know yet that this man was named Walter Pruitt, that he had spent 38 years as a state forest ranger and had retired 6 months ago to a house in Harwick that had been too quiet since his wife died of a stroke 4 years before. She did not know that he had come to the cabin the first time with the intention of reporting an unauthorized occupant, and had changed his mind when he heard the sound of an infant from inside, and had stood at the tree line for a long time before walking back to his truck. She learned his name 6 weeks later when he came again in the early afternoon, this time to the porch, and she opened the door and they looked at each other for a moment, and he said, Crispin Northgate, in the tone of a man completing a formality that both parties already understood was secondary to the matter at hand. Lavinia Caldwell, she said. He nodded. There's a pump behind the cabin, probably frozen. I can take a look if you want. The pump was frozen. He thawed it with careful work and a knowledge of old mechanisms that clearly came from a long history with them. And that afternoon, Lavinia had running water for the first time since the night she had walked out of the storm and into this place. She made coffee with it. Real coffee from the tin she had found on the shelf, which still had enough dried grounds at the bottom to produce something that bore a reasonable relationship to the thing it was meant to be. Crispin held the tin cup with both hands and said nothing for a long time. Then he said Evelyn used to drink this kind of tea in the evenings, the kind you can't find in the regular stores. Lavinia understood that Evelyn was his wife. She did not ask how long. She did not say she was sorry. She had been on the receiving end of enough condolences to know that sorry was a word people said because they did not know what else to say, and that the people who actually understood loss usually found something more specific. What kind was it? She asked. Chamomile with something else in it, something she ordered from a place in Vermont. It sounds like something worth remembering. He looked at his coffee. It is. They sat in the kind of quiet that two people share when they have both been through something that words don't improve, and the fire did its work, and Iris slept in her crate cradle, and outside the winter light moved slowly across the clearing. It was on a different afternoon, 8 weeks after that first encounter, that Lavinia's attention caught on the stone. She had been cleaning the fireplace surround, scraping away the accumulated soot from the base of the structure with a piece of flat rock, working methodically along the row of fieldstones that formed the lower section of the hearth. The task was not pleasurable, but it was satisfying in the way that practical work often is, and she had settled into the rhythm of it without much conscious thought. Her hand stopped at a stone near the lower left corner. It was darker than the ones around it. The mortar at its edges was thinner, not crumbled from age, but thin in the way mortar is when it has been applied over an original joint rather than laid with the original construction. She pressed her thumb against the seam. There was give, very slight, but real. She did not move immediately. She looked at that stone the way she had looked at books in the library, when she sensed there was something in them that required patience to find. She looked at it the way she had looked at her husband's face for 30 years learning it. Then she got the flat rock and worked its edge carefully into the lower seam. The mortar was dry rather than crumbled, which meant someone had applied it intentionally and not long enough ago for it to age past the original. The stone came free with 3 careful applications of pressure, pivoting outward like a door that had been waiting for the right hand to open it. Behind it was not a void. It was a deliberate space roughly cut into the stone behind the hearth, barely large enough for a single object. The object was an iron key. Long and heavy, its surface bloomed with rust, but its form intact. Lavinia held it up in the firelight and turned it, and felt the particular weight of something that had been placed rather than forgotten, something left with intention by someone who expected, or at least hoped, that the right hands would eventually find it. She tried it on every lock in the cabin over the following days. The wooden chest in the corner, the padlock on the cellar bulkhead outside the door, the window latches. Nothing fit. She was ready to accept that the key was a mystery without a solution, an object whose purpose had been buried with whoever had hidden it when she found the floor. Not found, felt. She was crossing the room with Iris on her shoulder, pacing the slow circuit she walked, when Iris was fussy in the late afternoons, and her heel came down on a board near the center of the room beneath the old rug that she had pushed aside months ago, and the sound was wrong. Not the solid return of wood against joist, something hollow beneath it, a resonance that suggested a space. She set Iris in the cradle. She pulled the rug further back. The outline was there in the floorboards, cut with enough precision to be invisible unless you were looking for it, a rectangle about 3 feet by 2, its edges fitted so closely against the surrounding boards that the gap between them was barely a seam. And in its center, flush with the surface of the wood, a small iron fitting with an opening she recognized. Her hands were steady when she retrieved the key from the mantelpiece. It entered the lock the way the right thing always enters the right place, with a smoothness that felt less like mechanics and more like recognition. And when she turned it, she heard a sound from below, a heavy iron bolt releasing, and the trap door swung upward on hinges that had been oiled recently enough to move without protest. Cool air rose from below. The scent of it was deep earth and preservation root vegetables, and something sweet, and beneath that sweetness, the particular quality of things that had been kept carefully in the dark. She found a stub of candle on the mantelpiece. She lit it from the fire. She descended the short wooden ladder into the space below, with the candle in one hand and the iron key in the other, and the light moved across what was down there. And Lavinia stood at the bottom of the ladder and was very still for a long moment. Shelves lined 3 walls, stone shelves built into the foundation itself, and on them, in rows that someone had arranged with the same methodical care she had once used to arrange books on a library shelf, were glass jars, dozens of them. Their contents pressed against the glass in the amber light of the candle green, beans and pickled beets, the dark jewel red of preserved tomatoes, the bright amber of apple jelly, and the deep purple of blueberry preserve. She unscrewed the lid of the nearest jar, the blueberry, and put a small amount on her finger and tasted it. Sweet, sharp, whole. Lavinia Caldwell sat down on the bottom step of the ladder with the jar in her hands and ate 3 careful spoonfuls of a dead woman's blueberry preserves and cried for the first time since the night she had walked into the storm, not for any one reason, but for all of them at once, for Candace and Robert, and the scholarship she had given away, and the down payment that had bought someone else's clean slate, and the 7 days she had stood beside her daughter's grave without letting herself fall apart, because she had understood even then that falling apart was a luxury she could not yet afford. She cried until she was done. Then she wiped her face with the back of her hand and looked around the cellar in the candlelight. That was when she saw the trunk. It was at the back of the cellar, partially obscured by a stack of wooden crates that had rotted away from usefulness, but retained their shape. Military issues, she thought, though she had no particular expertise in such things. Olive green paint on heavy metal, the corners reinforced with brass fittings, solid as something that had been built to survive conditions worse than this. 2 hasp latches on the front, the kind that do not require a key. And on the lid, scratched into the paint with a tool held by a careful hand, 2 letters. R.C. Lavinia looked at those 2 letters for a long time. Robert, her Robert's name, Robert Caldwell, and her own name, her married name, the name on her granddaughter's birth certificate, the name on the library card she had carried for 30 years. She did not touch the trunk yet. She was a woman who understood that some things required the right moment, and this was not a decision she was going to make in a cellar by candlelight, with her hands still shaking from crying. She climbed back up the ladder. She checked on Iris. She rebuilt the fire. Then she went back down and she dragged the trunk to the base of the ladder. It took 20 minutes and more strength than she had known she possessed, moving it inches at a time, the metal feet scraping against the stone floor. At the ladder, she had to tilt it and ease it up 1 rung at a time until she could get it over the lip of the trapdoor and onto the cabin floor. She positioned it in front of the fireplace. She sat down in the rocking chair. She looked at the 2 brass latches for a while. Then she opened them. The air that escaped smelled of oilcloth and old paper, and the particular stillness of things that had been sealed for a very long time. Inside, arranged with the care of someone who expected them to be found, eventually were 3 items. A bundle of documents tied with faded ribbon, a small tin box, and lying on top in a cream-colored envelope that had yellowed at the edges but remained intact, a single word written in a strong masculine hand. Family. Lavinia picked up the envelope. Her hands were not shaking. She was past the shaking now into something calmer and more serious on the other side of it. She opened it. The letter was dated 1965 and written on heavy paper in a hand that was confident and deliberate, the handwriting of a man who had learned to write at a time when handwriting was understood to matter. It began without preamble. To whoever of my blood finds this place. She read it twice. She read the part about building the cabin by hand in the years after the war. 1948 to 1952. 4 years of working alone on the mountain because the world below had become something he could not find his place in, and he had decided to stop trying. She read the part where he said he understood that his distance had cost his family something he could not calculate and could not undo. She read the part that said the land was his love, expressed in stone and wood and soil because he had never learned another language for it. And she read the last lines. I leave this not as a fortune, but as a foundation. The world may try to break you, but the earth will always hold you. Build your life here. Be free. Lavinia sat with that for a long time. The fire moved in the hearth. Iris slept in her cradle. On the mantelpiece, Robert's watch ticked in the dark. Two men named Robert Caldwell. One she had known for 41 years and lost too soon. One she had never met and who had died before she was born. Both of them in their different ways had made a place for her to stand. She put the letter down and picked up the document bundle. The deed was on top, and it was dated March 14th, 1948. And the name on it was Robert Harrison Caldwell, and the property it described was 240 acres of mountain land in Grafton County, New Hampshire. The boundaries running from the rock face behind the cabin to the border of the national forest on three sides, timber, and ridge and stream, 240 acres of land that had been in her family since before she was born, and that no one, not Dalton Holloway, not a court, not any power she could currently name, had the ability to take from her. She was not a squatter. She was not a fugitive. She was not a desperate old woman holding on by the narrowest of margins in someone else's forgotten corner of the world. She was home. The tin box held the bonds. Series E government issued the 50s and early 60s, a stack of them in denominations that had seemed significant when they were purchased, and whose current value she understood in an abstract way would be considerably larger than what was printed on their faces. She did not know the number. She would find out later. What she understood now, sitting on the floor of her grandfather's cabin with the firelight on her face and her granddaughter asleep 6 feet away, was that she had resources, options, a foundation exactly as the letter had said. She had been thrown away with $87. She had landed in a kingdom. She sat there until the fire needed attention, and Iris woke for her late feeding, and then she did what she had always done, what she had done in every version of hard that her life had offered her. She got up. She did the next thing. She kept going. It was 3 weeks after she opened the trunk on a morning when the snow had softened enough to suggest that somewhere far beyond the ridgeline spring was making its preliminary arrangements, that Crispin arrived at the cabin not with supplies, but with something in his expression that she recognized as information being withheld out of care for how it would land. He drank his coffee. He looked out the window. He said, I talked to someone at the county office about the deed situation. Lavinia waited. Your son-in-law has been asking around, Crispin said. Somebody down in Harwick saw you coming out of a lawyer's office. She had gone to Harwick 3 weeks earlier, the first time she had left the mountain since the night she arrived. Crispin had driven her. She had walked into the office of a young attorney named Araminta Greystone and placed the document bundle on the desk and waited while the woman looked at her with the undisguised assessment of someone who has learned to quickly categorize the cases that walk through her door and had placed Lavinia in the category of unlikely to be straightforward. These are from 1948, Araminta had said. The land has been in my family since then. The chain of title will need to be verified. Tax records. This could take months. And my fees. I can pay, Lavinia had said, and placed the envelope with 2 of the bonds on the desk. Araminta had looked at the bonds, looked at Lavinia, looked at the bonds again with a different quality of attention. Where have you been for the past 4 months? She had asked. On the mountain. Alone with the child. Not entirely alone. The attorney had closed her office at 5 that afternoon and read the full file until 2 in the morning. And Lavinia knew this because Araminta had called Crispin the next day to say so, which was how Lavinia had learned that Crispin and Araminta knew each other in the way that people in small towns know each other, which is to say thoroughly and with full awareness of everyone's history. Now Crispin was telling her that Dalton knew she was alive. He's been telling people you had some kind of breakdown after the funeral, Crispin said, that you took the baby and disappeared. He's been playing the worried family member. Lavinia looked at her coffee. He called the police the morning after, Crispin said. Filed a missing persons report. Of course he did. Araminta says the timing of everything in the job, he took the apartment, he signed for the car. The police call, she says it builds a picture. What kind of picture? The kind a prosecutor looks at. Lavinia set her cup down. Outside the window, the snow was still there, but it was different snow now, heavier and wetter, the snow of a season in transition. She had been in this cabin for almost 5 months. She had learned to split wood and render lard from the fat of a rabbit Crispin had brought her, and read the behavior of the fire to know when a storm was building. She had watched Iris move from the passive endurance of a newborn to something that engaged with the world around her, tracking light reaching for movement, holding Lavinia's finger with a grip that was for its size remarkably firm. She had built something here. Small and rough and impermanent looking from the outside, but real in the way that things are real when they have been earned rather than given. And Dalton Holloway, from his clean apartment in Charlotte with his new job and his unencumbered life, had just reminded her that he was not finished. She picked up Crispin's cup and her own and brought them to the makeshift washboard and began to clean them with the methodical focus she brought to every practical task. "Tell Araminta to keep going," she said. "She is. Tell her to move faster." Crispin looked at his hands. "There's something else." Lavinia did not stop washing the cups. He reached into his jacket pocket and set something on the table. A folded piece of paper, not the same hand as the maps he drew, but recognizable as his smaller and more careful than his usual marks. She dried her hands. She opened it. "He is hiring someone. Do not go to town alone. No signature." He had not needed one since the day she learned his name. Lavinia read it twice. She folded it along its original creases and placed it in the pocket of her jacket, the same pocket where she kept Robert's watch when she was working with her hands. She thought about Dalton and Charlotte making phone calls, spending money on a private investigator, building another version of the story where he was the rational center and everyone around him was the problem. She thought about how he had planned the night on the logging road, the research, the weather check, the phone call to the police already prepared. She thought about the way he had handed Iris to her without looking at the child's face. A man like that did not stop. Stopping required a capacity for acceptance that he did not possess. He would keep moving until something stopped him from the outside because there was nothing on the inside capable of calling a halt. Lavinia looked at Iris in the cradle by the hearth, at the small fist curled against one pink cheek, at the steady rise and fall of the chest that had been blue-tinged and struggling in the cold of a January night, and was now solid and certain and entirely defiantly alive. She thought about what Araminta had said, the kind a prosecutor looks at. She thought about Crispin's careful handwriting on that folded paper. She thought about her grandfather's words, "Build your life here." She was not afraid. She had walked through the part of this experience that breaks people through the cold and the dark and the long alone of it, and she was not broken. But she was clear-eyed enough to understand that the fight she had assumed was behind her was in fact still ahead, that Dalton Holloway was coming at her from a direction she could not entirely see yet, and that the difference between what she had survived and what was coming was the difference between surviving the wilderness and surviving a man who had resources, legal standing, and nothing left to lose. She reached into her pocket and held Robert's watch for a moment without looking at it. Then she let it go. She had things to do. The chicken coop fell down on a Tuesday. Lavinia did not know it was a Tuesday. She had stopped tracking days of the week sometime in February of the first year, when the distinction between a Tuesday and a Thursday ceased to carry any practical weight. What she knew was that it was the 9th month that the maples on the lower slope had gone fully gold and were beginning to release their leaves in the long afternoon wind, and that she and Crispin had spent the better part of 3 days building a structure intended to house 6 hens that the feed store in Harwick had agreed to sell her at a price she could manage. The south wall went first. One of the corner posts had not been set deep enough into the frozen ground, a calculation error that became apparent only when the weight of the roofing boards shifted the load, and the whole side gave way in a slow, almost dignified collapse, the boards folding outward and settling into the grass with a sound like a long exhale. Crispin stood beside the wreckage. He had his hands in his jacket pockets, and his expression was the particular neutral of a man who has seen enough things fail to have stopped being surprised by failure, and has not yet decided what to say about this particular instance of it. Lavinia looked at the pile of boards. She looked at the post that had been the problem, still upright, but listing now its inadequate depth in the earth exposed by what had pulled away from it. She picked up the hammer. She did not say anything, and she did not look at Crispin, and she began pulling the nails from the fallen boards one at a time, stacking the usable wood to her left and setting the compromised pieces to her right, working through the pile with the systematic attention she had learned to bring to every problem that presented itself in a form she could physically address. Crispin watched her for a moment. Then he picked up the post digger. They rebuilt the south wall that afternoon. They set the post 8 inches deeper than before. By the time the light went flat and thin on the ridge above them, the structure was standing again smaller than the original plan, adjusted to what the ground and the materials and the remaining light would actually support, rather than what they had hoped for at the outset. That evening, with Iris asleep and the fire doing its quiet work, Crispin said, "You didn't say a word when it fell." What would I have said? He thought about it. Most people would have said something. Most people haven't spent 10 months learning that the thing you say when something falls down is less important than what you do about it. He looked at his coffee. He did not reply, but the quality of his silence was the kind that means a person is thinking about what they just heard and finding it worth keeping. The hens arrived the following week, 6 of them in a wooden crate in the back of Crispin's truck, and Iris, who had been practicing the skill of standing by holding onto furniture for the past 3 weeks, let go of the porch railing when she heard them and took 2 entirely independent steps toward the sound before sitting down hard in the grass with an expression of complete astonishment at what her legs had just done. Lavinia was beside her in a moment, crouched down, and Iris looked up at her with the wide focused look of a child who has just discovered something enormous. And Lavinia laughed. Not the careful, controlled version of a laugh that she had been producing for months, something measured and appropriate. This was real, sudden, unmanaged, the laugh of a person who has been ambushed by joy in the middle of an ordinary morning, and it came out of her with a force that surprised them both. Crispin, coming around the side of the truck with the crate, heard it and looked over. He did not say anything. He just set the crate down and let the moment be what it was. It was Pastor Ezekiel Underhill who brought the seeds. Though Lavinia did not immediately understand that was what he was doing. He arrived on a Saturday morning in November of the first year driving a truck almost as old as Crispin's, a man of 55 with the unhurried manner of someone who has spent decades being present in rooms where people needed something they did not know how to ask for. Crispin had mentioned him in the way Crispin mentioned most things briefly and without elaboration, someone worth knowing, and had left it at that. Ezekiel sat on the porch steps with a cup of Lavinia's coffee and looked out at the clearing and the tree line and the mountain rising beyond it, and he asked what she needed from town. Not what had happened to her, not how she was managing, not what her plans were. He asked what she needed, which was a different kind of question and came from a different kind of person. Lavinia thought about it. Seeds, she said. Old varieties, the kind people grew before everything was bred for shelf life and shipping. I want to start a proper garden in the spring, and I want things that will come back that I can save seed from year to year. Ezekiel nodded slowly. He was not writing anything down. He was the kind of man who remembered what mattered. "I'll ask around," he said. 2 weeks later, he returned with 14 smaller envelopes, each one hand-labeled in different handwriting, different paper, different levels of care, in the lettering representing 14 different families in and around Harwick, who had responded to Ezekiel's quiet inquiry by going to their own drawers and shelves and bringing out the seeds they had been keeping. Mortgage lifter tomatoes from a family that had grown them since the 40s. Dragon-tongue beans from an old Dutch family in the next county. A winter squash variety whose name had been written in Swedish by someone's grandmother, and which Ezekiel had transliterated phonetically because he did not read Swedish. Lavinia sorted through the envelopes at the table that evening with Iris on her knee, and near the bottom of the stack, she found one that stopped her hand. The envelope was plain white. The handwriting on the label was careful and slightly formal, the penmanship of a woman who had learned to write at a time when it was taught as a serious skill. It said Brandywine tomato from my mother's garden. The name on the back of the envelope, written in the same careful hand, was E. Pendleton. Lavinia held it for a moment. She set it at the end of the row. She planted every seed in the spring. The Brandywine tomatoes grew well. The legal proceedings moved with a deliberateness that Lavinia had initially found maddening and had eventually accepted as the natural pace of systems built to withstand pressure. Araminta Greystone had turned out to be someone different from the woman who had looked at the old documents with politely concealed skepticism. She was thorough and she was tenacious, and she had a quality that Lavinia recognized from the best researchers she had known. Over 30 years in libraries, the ability to follow a thread through a tangle without losing it or forcing it. The chain of title on the land was established without significant complication. The tax records showed the property had been assessed but never claimed by any party after Robert Harrison Caldwell's death in 1971. The taxes going unpaid for several years before the county had placed the land in a deferred status that amounted in practice to it, sitting unclaimed in the records of Grafton County while the world moved on without noticing. Lavinia paid the back taxes from the bond proceeds. Araminta handled it. The land was clear. The bonds themselves were worth considerably more than Lavinia had allowed herself to imagine when she found them in the trunk. Araminta had contacted a specialist in government securities who had provided a valuation that Lavinia had read twice before she believed it, and even then had set aside to return to after she had done something physical for an hour because the number required grounding. $147,000. The land, Araminta explained during one of their meetings in the Harwick office, had also attracted the attention of a commercial appraiser who had been retained by a development firm looking at properties adjacent to the National Forest boundary. The firm's offer, which Araminta presented to Lavinia without recommendation, was $4 million for the full parcel. Lavinia listened to the number with the same steady attention she gave to every piece of information. "What happens to the cabin if I sell?" she asked. "It's part of the parcel. It goes." "Then I'm not selling." Araminta made a note. She did not argue. She had learned over the months of working with Lavinia that the woman's decisions came from a place that argument could not reach. Not stubbornness, not sentiment exactly, but the kind of clarity that belongs to people who have paid full price for their understanding of what matters. The criminal case against Dalton Holloway moved separately from the property matters on its own track and at its own pace, driven by the district attorney's office in Grafton County, rather than by Araminta directly. Though Araminta had provided everything she had to the prosecutors with a thoroughness that left very little room for ambiguity. Lavinia was not present for most of it. She had given her statement a long and precise account delivered to two prosecutors in Araminta's conference room, while Crispin sat in the waiting area outside, and Iris played on the floor at Lavinia's feet with a set of wooden blocks Crispin had made her, and after that the process had largely proceeded without requiring her presence. The GPS records from Dalton's vehicle. The Charlotte lease signed 4 days before the night on the logging road. The employment contract dated the following day. The police report Dalton had filed at 7 in the morning, 8 hours after he had driven away from a woman and an infant in a January blizzard, his voice on the recording steady and measured and exactly as concerned as a man needed to sound who was building a narrative rather than reporting a truth. Crispin testified. Lavinia knew this because he told her the morning before he went, sitting at her table with his hands around a cup of coffee, and she asked if he was all right with it, and he said that he had been waiting for the opportunity since the day he had stood at the tree line and heard an infant inside a cold cabin in the middle of winter and understood in his bones what that meant. He did not tell her what he had said on the stand. She did not ask. She trusted that whatever Crispin Northgate said in that courtroom was exactly what needed to be said in exactly the way it needed to be heard, because he was a man who had spent a career observing the natural world with patience and precision, and he brought the same qualities to every other form of truth. What she learned afterward from Araminta was that it had mattered. The deal that Dalton's attorneys eventually negotiated was the kind that exists because the alternative was worse. He admitted to felony reckless endangerment of a child. The sentence was suspended, 3 years of probation, a fine that his attorneys had bargained down from what the prosecutors initially sought, but that remained by any practical measure substantial, $85,000. To pay it, he had to liquidate what he had. The house in Horrocks sold in 30 days. The house that Lavinia's life savings had helped secure. The house where Candace had hung her photographs on walls that Dalton had taken them down from before the funeral guests had left. That house sold, and the proceeds went in part to satisfy the judgment, and the remainder went toward the legal fees of a man whose career in Charlotte had ended the same week the plea was entered, when his employer had cited the morality clause in his contract and terminated his employment, effective immediately. Lavinia learned all of this through Araminta in pieces over several months. She did not seek the information. It arrived when it was relevant to matters Araminta was managing on her behalf, and she received it the way she received most difficult information, with attention and without visible reaction, and then she went back to whatever she had been doing before. What she felt about it was not what she might have predicted she would feel in those early days in the cabin, when she had allowed herself to think about justice at all. It was not satisfaction. It was not relief. It was something quieter and less defined, the sense of a ledger coming into balance in the way that ledgers sometimes do when enough time passes and enough truth comes out. Not a writing of what cannot be righted, but a kind of acknowledgement from the world that what had been done was wrong and would not be set aside. That was enough. It had to be. The morning Estelle Pendleton came up the mountain was a morning in early June, 15 months after the night on the logging road, and Lavinia knew she was coming before she arrived because Crispin had mentioned without editorial that he had seen Estelle's car on the county road that ran past the trailhead. Lavinia was on the porch when the car appeared at the edge of the clearing. Estelle drove carefully, not used to the gravel, and parked with the exaggerated precision of someone concentrating on something other than parking. She sat in the car for a moment before she got out. She was carrying a basket. In it, Lavinia could see from the porch a cloth over the top and the rounded shapes of things beneath it. Estelle walked across the clearing slowly. She was a woman who had always moved with the confidence of someone who understood the social landscape of every room she entered, but she did not move that way now. She moved like someone who has rehearsed what she intends to say and is no longer entirely sure it is the right thing. She stopped at the foot of the porch steps and looked up at Lavinia. "I was wrong," she said. The words came out without preamble, without softening. "I believed him because he looked like the kind of man who tells the truth, and you look like the kind of woman who complicates things, and I know now that I had those exactly backwards." Lavinia looked at her. "I told my husband what I actually thought, which is that you were the most reasonable person in that police station that day. I should have said it then." Estelle paused. He filed the supplemental report. It went to the county DA's office. Lavinia had not known that. She held it for a moment. "Do you want to sit down?" she said. Estelle looked at the porch step and at the rocking chair beyond them, at the basket in her hands. "If that's all right." "There's coffee inside." Estelle came up the steps. She set the basket on the rail and took the cloth off the top, and inside were potatoes from her garden, a loaf of bread still warm, and a jar of apple preserves from her own shelves. Lavinia brought the coffee out. They sat in the afternoon light, the two of them, and Iris came out from inside with a wooden animal Crispin had carved for her, a small bear that she had been carrying everywhere for 2 weeks, and climbed up into Lavinia's lap without ceremony, and looked at Estelle with a direct, unself-conscious assessment of a child who has not yet learned to pretend. "She looks like her mother," Estelle said quietly. "She does," Lavinia said. They sat with that for a while. Estelle did not stay long. When she left, she paused at the bottom of the porch steps and turned back. "The seeds I sent," she said, "with Ezekiel, the Brandywines. They're doing well," Lavinia said. "You'll have to come back in August." Something moved across Estelle's face. Not absolution and not its refusal. Something in the territory between those things where most of the real transactions between people actually take place. "I'd like that," she said. She drove back down the mountain, and Lavinia watched the car until the trees took it, and then she looked down at Iris, who had fallen asleep in her lap with the wooden bear still in her fist, and she sat there in the afternoon sun and did not move for a long time. 5 years. That was the distance between the night on the logging road In the August afternoon when Iris brought the drawing, 5 years was long enough for the garden to establish itself in serious terraces down the slope. The soil improved by 5 seasons of compost and cover cropping into something dark and responsive that grew things with an exuberance that still surprised Lavinia in the early mornings when she went out to check what had come up overnight. Long enough for the barn Crispin and a crew of volunteers from Harwick had raised in the second spring to settle into the landscape as though it had always been there. Long enough for the lavender she had planted along the path to the porch to grow into thick, fragrant hedges that turned the approach to the cabin into something that visitors, and there were visitors, now sometimes stopped in the middle of just to breathe. Long enough for Lavinia to become something she had not set out to become, which was a resource. The Green Mountain Seed Sanctuary had not been planned. It had grown from the 14 envelopes Ezekiel Underhill had brought that first November, and from Lavinia's instinct formed in 30 years of librarianship that things worth preserving require active preservation rather than passive hope. She had begun documenting what she had, cataloging varieties with the same systematic attention she had once given to acquisitions corresponding with university extension programs and with individual gardeners who had heard about the project through the slow circulation of information that happens in rural communities when something real is being done. People came with paper packets and left with different ones. They came with questions and left with seeds and instructions written in Lavinia's clear librarian's hand. A small article in a regional agricultural journal had brought a wider correspondence, and from that correspondence had come gradually a sense of the work as something with a shape and a purpose beyond her own mountain. She had not sought public attention. When a journalist from a national magazine had found the trail to the cabin and walked up it with a recorder and a set of prepared questions, he had been met at the clearing's edge by Crispin, who had explained with complete courtesy and absolute firmness that the woman he was looking for was occupied with her life and not available to perform it for an audience. The journalist had written something anyway, a column not about Lavinia, but about the value of being left alone to do important work, and it had been read by the kind of people who understood what it was actually saying. Araminta still came on weekends, trading the briefs that had accumulated on her desk through the week for the work of her hands in Lavinia's garden, which she approached with the same focused energy she brought to everything, and had improved considerably since the first season, when she had planted 3 rows of carrots too close together and thinned them with the reluctance of someone making personnel decisions. She had stayed in Harwick the Boston offer she had been considering when Lavinia first walked into her office, having lost its appeal sometime during the months when the work she was doing felt like the most important work she had ever done. Crispin had built a second structure on the property, a small and practical outbuilding on the north side of the clearing, partly for tools and partly Lavinia understood, without it being said directly, because a man who had spent 4 years alone in a house that was too quiet for him had found in this place something that he had not expected to find again and was not in any hurry to leave. He taught Iris to identify birds by their calls. He taught her to read the direction of coming weather from the shape of clouds over the ridge. He taught her to whittle, starting with simple shapes, a round, then a flat disc, then gradually more complicated forms, until the small wooden bear she had carried everywhere at 18 months was joined on her shelf by a gallery of animals in various states of completion, a deer that was almost finished, a fox that was just becoming recognizable, an owl that Crispin said still needed work, but that Iris insisted was done. Iris called him Uncle Crispin. Lavinia had not introduced him that way. It had simply happened in the way that the truest designations happen from the inside rather than from the outside, from the reality of a relationship rather than from a description of one. On the August afternoon when Iris brought the drawing, Lavinia was sitting on the porch swing. Crispin had hung from the beam the previous spring, a long board of smooth white oak suspended on chains that moved with a sound she had come to associate with the particular quality of late afternoon light on that mountain, golden and unhurried. Iris came up the steps at a run, which was her standard speed, and thrust the paper at Lavinia with the complete confidence of a child, presenting something she is certain will be received as the important thing it is. It was a drawing in crayon produced with the bold lack of concern for proportion that 5-year-olds bring to representation. A cabin in the center of the page, roughly square with a chimney emitting a cheerful spiral of gray smoke. A sun in the upper right corner, yellow and large, and crowned with the rays that children draw instinctively as though the sun itself requires no instruction. And in front of the cabin, 3 figures holding hands. The tallest figure had silver hair rendered in careful silver crayon, wearing what appeared to be a blue dress. The smallest figure wore red, her hair a sunburst of yellow strokes. The middle figure wore what was clearly a wide-brimmed hat, the kind of hat that had a specific wearer on this mountain, and was drawn in the brown and green that Iris associated with that person. Iris pointed at the drawing with one small finger. "Home," she said. It was not a question. It was not an observation. It was a declaration made with the full authority of a 5-year-old who has learned the meaning of a word through its complete experience rather than its definition. Lavinia looked at the drawing for a long moment. Then she pulled Iris onto the swing beside her and put her arm around the child's shoulders and held her, and Iris settled against her with the unself-conscious ease of a person in the right place, the wooden bear tucked under one arm, the drawing held loosely in the other hand. The light on the mountain was doing what it did in August, turning everything it touched the color of something worth keeping. The lavender along the path gave off its particular scent, which Lavinia had come to understand was not just a smell, but a form of information telling her about the temperature and the moisture in the air, and the lateness of the season with more precision than any forecast. She thought about the night on the logging road. She let herself think about it fully, which she could do now in a way she could not have done for a long time, the way you can eventually look at a scar directly once the wound beneath it has actually healed. She thought about Dalton's face in the dashboard light, and the sound of the car lock and the red of the taillights going away. She thought about the 4 minutes she had stood still in the storm, and the thought she had not been able to stop. "I do not know if I can do this." She had not known. That had been true. And she had done it anyway, which was the only version of courage that Lavinia Caldwell had ever been able to respect. Not the kind that comes without fear, but the kind that exists alongside it and acts despite it. The ordinary, grinding, daily kind that most people manage without anyone calling it by its proper name. Dalton Holloway was somewhere south of here, in a version of his life that had contracted to fit what he had left after the judgments and the settlements and the terminations had taken their portions. She did not think about him often. When she did, she felt something she had not expected to feel, which was not anger and not satisfaction and not the generous warmth of forgiveness, but a kind of pity that cost her nothing because she did not need to extend it to him personally. She pitied the architecture of a mind that had looked at a newborn child and seen only inconvenience. That was a poverty more complete than anything Lavinia had experienced in 10 months of a Vermont winter, and she could afford to pity it because it was not hers. From inside the cabin came the sound of the coffee grinder, which meant Crispin was making the late afternoon pot, which meant Araminta's car would appear at the edge of the clearing within the next 20 minutes right on schedule, because Araminta Greystone had turned out to be one of those people whose predictability was itself a form of love. Iris had gone still beside her, the drawing still in her hand, watching a monarch butterfly work its way along the lavender hedge with the absolute absorption of a child for whom the world is still entirely new. Lavinia looked out at the mountain at the tree line where the old hemlocks stood in their patient formations, at the rock face behind the cabin where her grandfather had set the first stone of the foundation in 1948 with his own hands, and no one to tell him it would matter. It had mattered. She thought about the letter, the words she had read in the cellar by candlelight, while Iris slept above her and the fire held its ground in the cold. Build your life here. Be free. She had not built the life she had planned. She had not built the life she had lost. She had built this one stone by stone and season by season in a place she had not chosen and could not have imagined out of materials that grief and necessity had left her with. Her grandfather had been right about one thing in particular, the thing she understood most fully now. The earth holds you, not gently, not easily, not without cost, but it holds. It is the one thing that does not change its mind about you, does not recalculate your value, does not decide one morning that you are more trouble than you are worth. You work it and it responds. You tend it and it gives back. You stay and it remembers you stayed. Crispin came to the porch door with 2 cups of coffee and looked out at the swing at Lavinia and Iris in the afternoon gold and set 1 cup on the porch rail within Lavinia's reach, without saying anything the way a person does things when words would be less than the moment deserves. Iris looked up at him. "I made a picture," she said, holding it out. He took it. He looked at it for a long moment, the 3 figures holding hands in front of the cabin under the large yellow sun. "That's pretty good," he said, which was high praise from Crispin Northgate, and Iris received it with the dignity it deserved. Lavinia picked up the coffee cup from the rail. She held it with both hands the way she always did, feeling the warmth of it move through her palms, and she looked out at the mountain in its August abundance, at the garden coming into its fullest season, at the clearing that had become season by season, and choice by choice the most real place she had ever lived. On the mantelpiece inside the cabin, visible through the open door, Robert's watch kept its steady count. It had not stopped once since the night she had set it back to the correct time after reading her grandfather's letter. It had kept its time through 5 winters and 5 thaws, through the construction of the barn and the establishment of the seed sanctuary, in the planting of the lavender, in the first steps Iris had taken on the grass, and all the steps that had followed. Steady, unhurried, not loud. The way the things that endure always are. Lavinia Caldwell sat on her grandfather's mountain with her granddaughter pressed warm against her side, and the coffee in her hands and the light going gold on everything she had built. And she breathed in the lavender and the turned earth and the wood smoke from Crispin's fire, and she thought, this is what it feels like when you finally stop running from what you lost long enough to see what you have found. This was not a lesser life than the one she had planned. It was not a consolation for the life that grief had taken. It was his own thing, entirely built from the ground up on a foundation that no one could sell out from under her, and no one could drive away in the night, a life of her own making in the fullest sense of that phrase, and she had paid for every inch of it with something real. Iris leaned her head against Lavinia's arm. The butterfly finished with the lavender and rose on the warm air above the garden. The light on the mountain held as long as it could, the way light always does at the end of a good day, as though it knows that what it is leaving is worth staying for. And then it went gently over the ridge, and the mountain settled into its evening, and Lavinia stayed where she was.